In the week of Thanksgiving in 1983, 3 teenagers were arrested in Baltimore for the murder of a 14-year-old boy at a city school killed for his jacket. Alfred Chestnut, Ransom Watkins, and Andrew Stewart were tried and convicted to life in prison, despite their insistence that they did not commit the crime, and despite evidence that pointed to another kid. Over the years, all 3 men maintained their innocence. In fact, when they came up for parole, each one declined because it would have required accepting responsibility for the crime. All 3 despaired their dire and seemingly hopeless situation. And yet one of them, Alfred Chestnut, clung to a flicker of improbable, unexplainable hope that eventually the truth would set them free. This morning we're going to hear from the prophet Jeremiah. And prophet Jeremiah was a man who clung to an improbable hope, even in a dire situation. He too persisted in speaking the truth, even though it was rejected by many who heard him. Jeremiah was a spokesman for God in the years following the good King Josiah that we thought about last week, when the people of Judah had turned away from God once again. Jeremiah had a vision in which the Lord reached out and touched his mouth with God's hand, and God said to him, "I have put my words in your mouth." Those words were harsh words, bitter words, words of judgment against the people of Judah for their disobedience and their unfaithfulness to God. They were words of a coming disaster, which the Babylonian armies were going to attack and destroy Jerusalem. Dead bodies would litter the streets, including the king's dead body, and those who survived would be taken away as exiles, as prisoners of war. The nation of Judah would no longer exist. Buildings would be heaps of rubble, and the land would be abandoned and unsafe. For the leaders of Jerusalem, the Lord gave Jeremiah these words: "Look, disaster is spreading, a mighty storm rising up from the ends of the earth. Weep and wail, you shepherds, you leaders of the flock, for your time to be slaughtered has come." As you can imagine, no one wanted to hear those kinds of prophecies, those kinds of words, those prophecies of gloom and doom. Jeremiah was very unpopular. At one point, the officials seized him and said, "This man should be sentenced to death because he has preached against us." The king had him thrown in prison in Jerusalem, accusing him of betrayal. So Jeremiah just wrote God's words down on a scroll and had his assistant take that scroll to the king and to the officials and read it to them. But the king threw the scroll into the fire. Of course, their refusal to listen did not prevent King Nebuchadnezzar and the armies of Babylon from advancing towards Jerusalem from the north, nor did it keep Pharaoh and his army from advancing from the south. Regardless of whether they paid attention or not, God's warnings were coming true. It reminds me of a first-time mother that I cared for when I was a nurse in a labor and delivery unit in a hospital outside Chicago. The woman had been so fearful of that coming time of labor pains that she refused to talk about it with anyone or let anyone else talk about it. She just wanted to live in denial. And one day, her husband brought her to the hospital, clearly in labor. But the woman continued to insist that we let her go back home because it was not time to have that baby yet. But wave after wave of pain came, and no denial could hold back those contractions. The good news is that even in the midst of a difficult and painful and uncertain labor, the situation is pregnant with hope, if you excuse my pun. The mother's round tummy, the thumping of a heartbeat on a monitor are all signs of hope, signs of the gift of life that will be arriving. For the nation of Judah, unfortunately, there was little sign of hope. The situation was bleak, annihilation seemed inevitable, and in fact, they had already watched while the northern nation of Israel had been conquered and carried away as captives by the Assyrians. The tree of God's people, Israel and Judah, was rotting. Israel had already been withered and had been cut away, and now the remaining portion of the tree was dying, and the axe was raised to chop it down. Just when things looked the most bleak, when the words that the Lord was giving to Jeremiah were the most gruesome, God gives Jeremiah another word to share. It's a word of hope. It's a word that we often look to at the beginning of this season of Advent. It's recorded in Jeremiah 33. It's also printed on the back of your bulletin. Yet the time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill my gracious promise, my good word to the people of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time, I will raise up a righteous branch from David's line, who will do what is just and right in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, Jerusalem will live in safety, and this is what he will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. A word of hope. Israel and Judah may be a rotted out tree. It may become a chopped off dead stump. But new life would eventually sprout from what appeared to be that dead stump. At this time, the leader, at that time, when that sprout came, the leader would be a descendant of David, who did what was right, what was just, who would save God's people and be their protector and their peace. This is one of the messianic promises that's recorded in the Old Testament, one of those words of promise that God would send a Messiah, a Christ, an anointed one. Unlike the situation of the laboring mother, hope was not obvious to anyone who heard this word through Jeremiah. Perhaps the least of all to Jeremiah himself, who was sitting in a prison and fearing for his life with the double threat of the approaching enemy and the wrath of his own people. So God gave him an additional sign. God told Jeremiah that someone would come to the prison cell to sell him a field near his hometown. A field in a nation that was going to be attacked and abandoned in a land that would soon be absolutely worthless. But the Lord told Jeremiah to buy that land and secure that deed, saying, "For in the future, my people will once again buy houses and fields and vineyards in this land." The hope was not obvious, but God's promise was true. It was trustworthy enough to invest in a field and stake his life on it. That's what we're to practice in this Advent season. We're to practice holding on to the hope of God's promises, to the truth of God's word, even as the days get shorter and darker and colder, even when situations around us look bleak. That bleakness, for some of you, may be health challenges that make you feel like your body is withering and the axe is raised to cut you down. Or perhaps you have a loved one who faces such a health crisis. Last week, following worship, we learned about Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, and the facts are pretty grim. Every 60 seconds in the United States, someone develops Alzheimer's disease, and that rate is going to double in the next 30 years. There are moments when the social ills of our nation seem pretty bleak. The crisis of drug addiction, and particularly to pain medications, and we just can't seem to reverse those numbers, that trend. The problem of homelessness and the discouraging reality that there are so few housing options for those who don't have financial resources. The immigration crisis with thousands of traumatized children. The latest climate data showing that environmental disaster is coming much sooner than expected. The sadness of wrongdoing by national leaders when so few elected officials seem capable of making decisions based on what is true or what is responsible, as opposed to what is simply politically expedient. All around the world, people are rising up in protest, trying to have their voices and their needs heard in Chile, in Bolivia, Iraq, Hong Kong. It's as if another one of Jeremiah's prophecies is coming true again. Coming true again like it did for the refugees in his day in Ramah. Jeremiah prophesied, "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping, mothers weeping for their children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more." In Matthew's gospel, this prophecy of Jeremiah's is connected to the mourning mothers in Bethlehem when King Herod ordered the slaughter of baby boys in his jealous response to the news that one of them was going to be the future king of the Jews. The people in those days longed for that just and righteous king, that Messiah. They longed for a life free from the oppression of Rome. They were waiting for God's promise of a Messiah, a leader who would save them, the leader God had promised through Jeremiah. If you started those Advent readings in the Gospel of Luke, you may have gotten to chapter 2, which tells the story of a man named Simeon and a woman named Anna, who were watching for this new leader, for this Lord's Christ. I don't know about you, but when I look for a sign of a new and up-and-coming great leader, I've got my eye on young people who are already showing some leadership abilities and some promise. But both Simeon and Anna catch sight of an infant, a newborn, the newborn Jesus being brought into the temple by Mary and Joseph as the law required them. And because they are watching for signs of hope with the eyes of faith, they see in this helpless infant the promise coming true. They see the Lord's Messiah. And then 33 years later, another sign of hope is given in a situation that seems even more grim. Many had the great hope that Jesus was the Lord's Messiah, just as Peter had said, "You are the Messiah." And yet this hope was crushed when Jesus was arrested and given a death sentence. The sentence is carried out, and Jesus is dead like the stump of the tree that he was killed on. And those who loved him wept and watched while his body was laid in a tomb. And then, 3 days later, those who never imagined that a cross or a tomb could be a symbol of hope discover that it's a sign of the greatest hope of all. The tomb was empty. The power of death was defeated. Jesus was indeed the Messiah, but instead of saving one nation from political oppression, he was saving the whole world from the oppression of evil and sin. We are to be searching for signs of hope with the eyes of faith in this Advent season. We are to be looking at situations of pain and despair with the faith that God can turn those situations into places of hope. I'd like to share with you one more sign of hope in a situation where it was not obvious at all. On Monday of this past week, at 5:15 p.m., the doors of a Baltimore circuit court opened, and Alfred Chestnut, Ransom Watkins, and Andrew Stewart walked free after 36 years in prison for a crime they did not commit. Alfred Chestnut, who had never lost hope, discovered new evidence last year that implicated the real killer. He submitted it along with a request that their case be reviewed by Baltimore's Conviction Integrity Unit. And the three men who had relied on their friendship and relied on their faith in God to get them through that dark time. Andrew Stewart had even been teaching Bible classes while he was in prison to his fellow prisoners, allowing God to use him in whatever way God pleased during that time of dark time and place in his life. They mourned the injustice that had been done to them, but they maintained hope that the Lord is our righteousness, and they rejoiced in God's faithfulness in bringing about what was just and what was right. Jeremiah spoke the truth when he shared God's words. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. They are plans for peace, not disaster, to give you a future and a hope." This Advent, look for signs of hope. Look for Jesus as he continues to work in places and times of grief and discouragement, and then bring hope. Then take that hope and shine it on those around you. I'd like to read for you a prayer written by a woman named Pamela Hawkins. It's a prayer about hope. O hope, prism through which all true light breaks, illuminating paths and patterns, ways and wanderers. Refract our short-sightedness, that we may look to the east with distant vision and find our Advent way. Come, O hope, focus our blurred and distracted sight, that we might see clearly the one who is coming. Amen.